In the year of our Lord 2002, I entered a Faustian pact with a being I could only surmise was a Sumerian trickster god. It was 1 a.m. in my parents' basement, and I was a preteen playing Dragon Warrior 3, and yeah, that's Warrior, not Quest, on my Game Boy Color when I summoned an actual Mesopotamian terror by speaking aloud a simple lament.
I wish this game were remade with real graphics.
I'm a bit uncomfortable divulging what I traded for this wish to be given form, but I see now that in 2024, this has finally come to pass. Back in the early 2000s, I would have legally become a resident of Silent Hill to get a remake of Silent Hill 2 that looks like the one that we got this year, and that game is just one in a torrential climate of banger games getting the remake treatment. Romancing Saga 2, Persona 3, System Shock, and Final Fantasy VII, and please don't say the "it's a sequel" thing because, yeah, we all know, all received remakes or reimaginings on console this year. And we're capping 2024 off with another crucial remake, and perhaps the one I sold a bit of my soul for, Dragon Quest III. So the question is, will the monkey's paw curl for the Dragon Quest III HD-2D remake? I wanted to make a video to highlight the things I love about DQ3, aspects of the game some may consider timeless, and I wanted to explore the question of how the remake of Dragon Quest III can capture the spirit of its original release. To frame this issue, we'll look at what I consider to be the 3 pillars of DQ3. I'll glaze the game up like a Krispy Kreme donut, and we'll circle back to the persistent theme of what can the remake of DQ3 offer in 2024. We'll cover how customization lends itself to DQ3's spirit of adventure, the game's innovations on mashing the A button, aka the combat, and the magnitude of content and completionist potential that this game offers. Throughout this video, I'll be showing some footage of the other different versions of Dragon Quest III, but most of my talking points and analysis will be directed toward the Super Famicom, Game Boy Color, and modern mobile/Switch ports, because those have the most robust amount of content and balancing. There are some obscure ports of the game that I didn't play for this video, but I did even manage to try out the Japanese PS4 port, which for some reason only came out for the Switch in the West. It was my way of coping with the fact that I never got the Japanese exclusive Dragon Quest XI PS4 either.
I have this and you don't.
The Super Famicom version is easily my favorite visually, and because I recently streamed the English fan translation of the game in its entirety, that's probably the one you're going to be seeing the most of in this video. And with that, let's get into our first main point, customization and the spirit of adventure. Visually, the Akira Toriyama art style suggests a whimsical yet deeply determined tone to the world and the game's plot. We're able to have somewhat lighthearted vignettes like giving black pepper to a spiceless kingdom, juxtaposed with a story of Romeo and Juliet-esque tragic love, and we watch our hero's father ostensibly die in the opening cutscene. It feels in key, and the fantasy is easily buyable. But we were talking visuals, so let's get back to that. So because of Toriyama's passing, Square Enix decided to put the new artist's work more front and center to the game's presentation. Your mileage may vary, but the more glossy, bubbly style of the in-game assets does seem to fit the HD-2D quite well. And the artist who worked on the cover art for the game also worked on Octopath Traveler, another HD-2D game, so it feels a little consistent. Whether or not this style fits the game will ultimately be up to subjective experience, but it's important to try to see things in context and in motion on your own terms before making any serious judgments. Toriyama's work is too important to the brand and identity of the series to simply just drop, and even based on what we've seen so far, it seems spiritually accurate to the original look of the game. So the world itself is based off of the real-world globe, And the journey around the world is varied and culturally dense, and each quest is contextually tied to each real-world analog or region. The pacing of the narrative and exploration of the world allow for enough player agency to do things at their own pace. For example, you can explore some dungeons out of order, but there's usually a key or MacGuffin you have to find to open up the next tier of the adventure. The big quest in the beginning of the game has you searching for 3 keys, but you're stumbling around the dangerous world and falling into stories and quests of the towns that you visit instead of just simply checking something off of a list. Tasked not only by the king of our region but the world itself, taking down the Archfiend Baramos, a name vaguely reminiscent of a certain Enrique Iglesias hit in the 90s, is our main goal. He's always a looming threat, and you can see his effects on the flora, fauna, and townsfolk throughout the game. Many big arcs or quests are optional, and you can choose to bring them to their natural conclusion or leave them unfinished to get a nice item in the interim. This is tabletop RPG stuff. It's scenario design that plays on and with player expression. From the Super Famicom Remake onward, the game begins with a personality test that not only can read you to filth, but can also frame your entire journey. Is this the personality I want to have? Is this the person who I want to be? Even if these more existential questions don't really affect much in the gameplay itself, they do help immerse the player in the world and maybe even put the RP in RPG. This is one of my favorite personal flourishes the game offers, and I'm a major sucker for games like Saga Scarlet Grace and most of the titles in the Ogre series that allow for the player's personality to actually affect stats and character building. It serves as a way to immediately engage the player on an individual level, so here's to hoping the remake continues that trend with this personality test. The customization and party building provide a deeply layered background for the fairly minimalist combat mechanics. We'll talk a bit about how jobs interact with combat a bit later, though. You can create a myriad of party configurations with all the available jobs, and the jobs offer unique expressions of one's playstyle. For example, you can do a typical offensive caster, healer, and DPS to keep things classic, or you could just run 3 jesters whose movements in battle can be completely random if the game decides to act up. Interestingly, even something like the Jester, or Gadabout, or Goof Off, can y'all tell that there's a bit of inconsistency with both official and fan translations here? Anyway, but the Jester, a class that seems built around a challenge run, can be part of optimizing your play. Because Jesters can move directly into the extremely powerful Sage class, nothing ever feels worthless, and the concept of toughing out a harder early game to optimize your party is the exact kind of Hero's Quest, the sort of linear progression business that Dragon Quest is known for. There's always a bigger picture for the player to consider. You choose your party composition, but optimizing it is always the center of the gameplay loop. Similar to the quiz to determine the hero's personality in the beginning of the game, you can name your party and influence your party members' stats and personalities as you recruit them. Just keep in mind that you're essentially practicing the video game form of eugenics. Pokemon fans should have no issue with this. You can't beat the allegations. I'm starting the Google Doc right now. Each character has a personality, which dictates their growth. For example, tough means the character gets more HP and stamina per level up, but might get less speed and MP. Certain items can affect personalities as long as they're equipped too, so even though that ring you just found might give you some gnarly bonuses, it could change your stat growth to something that you don't want. Acquiring spells that level up encourages battling. Knowing you can cycle through jobs means you're always earning and moving towards something. Exploring the vast world allows better loadout potential. Finding mini-medals allows incremental progress toward bigger rewards. The remake offers a new job and even more job-unique abilities, so this will hopefully go even further to expand the party building. The ability to switch up your party by simply returning to the main city allows even more freedom of choice. Part of the adventure is determining if you've brought along the right party for the job. If this isn't the party you want to work with for the rest of the game, it never has to be. You could dump those nerds and replace them. To lessen the stress and provide more fuel to the hero's journey fire, there's a safety net mechanic in play. You don't get a game over on death. Rather, if you die, you get teleported back to your last save with half of your money. You retain your EXP, items, and everything else, but you'll have to make your way back to where your journey was cut short. This allows for not only clever ways of routing the game to get to places faster, but it means that your work is never sweepingly taken away from you, and thus you could afford to take some adventurous chances by trying to work your way through a higher level area. You're always working toward that goal. The remake offers difficulty options that are in line with modern Dragon Quest games to further push some of the gameplay concepts and provide some much needed accessibility. But part of me does worry that the modularity of this can offset the deliberate gameplay progression and undercut the no game over mechanic even further. Let's look at how Dragon Quest III innovates on mashing the A button to get through all those hundreds or thousands of encounters you're going to sit through as you go through this game. I might need to clarify that we're looking at the combat system of a game that is mostly intact from its roots as a 1988 turn-based RPG for the NES. While the remakes and further iterations of Dragon Quest III did spruce up combat and add a few dynamic changes or bells and whistles, the core of the battle system isn't amazingly different from the original release. This works better than it might seem because this simplicity calls back to the staple minimalism of the Dragon Quest series combat. Silly names aside, the array of spells actually requires a lot of deliberation to use properly. We're not always just picking a one-size-fits-all spell. For example, the ice spells start out with more single-target utility, while the fire spells evolve to include area of effect options sooner, while other schools of magic, like the wind spells, provide more diverse offensive options for characters like priests who don't have much in the way of direct damage offensive magic. Elemental weaknesses are always worth considering too, and I'm not going to pretend like this game doesn't fall back on that old tired concept of hit the blue enemy with the red spell. But what I am saying is that there is a very deliberate use of your skills in battle. Instant death or crowd control spells require experimentation based on enemy resistances. So this can be absolutely devastating to the enemies who are susceptible to them, but it might require some experimentation on the player's part, and some trial and error. Once again, these qualities are not innovative for the genre or series, but it bears repeating that they interact well with the rest of the subsystems and the big picture of the game that we mentioned earlier. Groups and packs. So a key component to combat is determining how to best use your AoE skills and how to prioritize specific enemies. Resource management is pertinent to the gameplay flow because dungeons can be long, full of dozens of encounters, and will sometimes conclude with a boss fight. The goal of each dungeon often seems to be to preserve your MP or healing items for what could be a tough battle at the end, and you'll often need to have enough MP to use a spell to escape from the dungeon so that backtracking through encounters doesn't finish you off. Modern RPGs don't usually play too strongly to the concept of resource management, so it's possible that the remake could follow this trend. Alternatively, because of the new skills and abilities, it might be more crucial to preserve MP for tough fights, provided that item distribution and availability doesn't completely trivialize this aspect of the game as well. The rhythm of combat might be a bit rigid, especially with how the UI looks, how the animations always seem to play out in the same way, and the way that your spells trade back and forth. But this rhythm does play directly into the resource management aspects that we just discussed. A good example of this is the Baramos showdown. This is one of the first fights in the game that really truly tests your party composition and loadout, and the fight follows a set pattern. It's up to the player to respond to it with proper setup and heals. Because a lot of encounters follow a very observable AI script, many encounters can feel very tank and spank, and most of the big ones follow a fairly static cycle of starting with buffs and debuffs, attacking and healing with one character. Giving enemies more combat options and introducing new mechanics in general can go a long way for boss fights in the remake, and it's possible this element of the game can become even more climactic. I don't think this rigidity is necessarily a bad thing, because it really does encourage specific planning. The boss fights playing out like a storybook as well goes part and parcel with the whole presentation of Dragon Quest as a whole to me. Now, this might seem braggadocious to somebody who doesn't engage with the game systems and is just mashing A, but I believe that all these components culminate in an experience that doesn't necessitate grinding, but rather encourages it. There's some critical division around All Trades Alley/Dharma Temple, the area and time when you can change your party's classes and upgrade them into sages. Whether or not the game really opens up or just becomes a grind fest is a point of player perspective, but I feel like it's up to an individual's sensibilities to determine what they want to get out of the game. I wouldn't say this if I hadn't done it myself, but you can definitely beat the game with little to no active grinding. There's a reason you can do a solo hero clear of this game. It's built for a variety of different playstyles and approaches. There is always a distinct dopamine reward for wanting to play because of how the linear progression works and is rewarded, but few can resist the call of new spells, abilities, and the elusive metal slime jackpot. Either you get a ton of EXP for killing these things, or they run away and leave you real sad. Is grinding fun? I don't know, fella. That one's up to you to decide, but the game does offer you enough tools and options to pursue it if you want. This leads us to our final pillar, which is the idea of a complete experience, how that applies to Critical Path, or the main game, and how it applies to completionists. So throughout the game, there are 3 big completionist milestones. Mini medals. They're found in chests, hidden spots on the ground that you can see with the thief ability Seek Out or Map Magic, and interactable overworld objects like drawers, cabinets, etc. In the Super Famicom version, this means there can be medals in Pachisi maps, which can be an RNG nightmare, and the original version did not have these mini medals. The second big completionist milestone is treasure, chests, hidden items, etc. This requires a lot of combing through dungeons, some of which are optional, and thoroughly exploring towns to find. You often have to engage very closely with the game's terrain, snake your way through towns or borders of areas to find some of this treasure. And the game really wants to reward you for paying attention to it and staying observant, because some of this treasure rules. And the third completionist component to me are spells and abilities. Because of how class changing works, you halve your stats and retain any spells or abilities that you learned before. It's easy to want to collect them all with all these spells. This can take a while to accrue if you're cycling through all of the classes, but it does provide some extra incentive to switch up your jobs in the mid and the late game. We've already seen that the remake will introduce abilities, which are skills separate from spells, like sword slashes that do elemental damage. These weren't in the original releases, but they are present in most modern Dragon Quest games, and it's been shown that you can pass these down like spells in the original game. Beyond the game-wide goals, the Super Famicom and onward versions included some post-game material that honestly I'd rather not spoil too much in this video. I will say that it relates to a dungeon in some way, so there's always something to look forward to after you finish the main game. The Game Boy Color release somehow has the most content by having an additional post-game dungeon and monster medals. So basically, each monster has a random chance to drop a medal, of which there are 3 tiers of increasing rarity: bronze, silver, and gold. Monster medal hunting ends up being a game-wide collection side quest that could easily eat up 100+ hours. It could be argued that this is simply busy work, but it's optional for a reason. And I'm averse to the devs tying a post-game area to this collectathon though, so hopefully this gets adjusted if monster medals do make an appearance in the remake. The new Monster Wrangler class in the remake may replace monster medals, but introduce the concept of catching monsters in its stead, which would be a little bit more interesting than praying for a random drop chance, at least to me anyway. It's also worth noting that the monster medals are only in the GBC version of Dragon Quest III. I didn't mention this when I was talking about Treasure, but the Super Famicom and GBC versions have several Pachisi boards, or treasures and trapdoors as it was later localized as, that consist of using rare ticket items to play a board game. This minigame is basically a bite-sized version of Itadaki Street, which is a game concepted by Dragon Quest series producer Yuji Horii. So it's easy to see why his baby made it into Dragon Quest III eventually. So some treasures and mini medals are locked behind this game. Completing the optional content requires a lot of luck or a lot of patience. The more recent ports of Dragon Quest III axed Pachisi, and it's already been confirmed the remake will not include it either, for better or worse. I personally think gambling has a very interesting place in Dragon Quest history and lore and gameplay mechanics, but that's a topic for another time. Modern Dragon Quest entries have put a strong focus on post-game content, so I can't imagine the remake will be any different. Whether or not the Super Famicom or GBC post-game dungeons get reworked or if new late or post-game dungeons get added remain to be seen, but with the addition of new difficulty modes and more tools to play with, not giving us a true test of our power in the final hours would be a mistake. Because attention has always been given to the post-game of Dragon Quest III in subsequent releases, I have faith the remake will continue this trend. Although I don't think modern staples like a rebalanced New Game Plus are always a good replacement for a more typical, well-designed post-game. Now that we've thrown out some analysis of the original, let's wrap up by talking about the remake itself. I believe in full disclosure, so I'll put my bias out there right now. I do not like HD-2D. Does that mean I won't like the Dragon Quest remake? Absolutely not. I'm so pumped for this game, I'm making a video to yap about it. I think HD-2D is fine in a vacuum, but I hold fast the belief that the style is becoming increasingly homogenized, and I worry that the clarion call of thousands of capital G gamers might be influencing developers to bring this style into homes that might not belong. I fear it's already too prolific, and while I think HD-2D can be aesthetically appealing at times, I would prefer it not to be the de facto style for every RPG remake from here on out. I'm deafened by countless cries of
Remake Chrono Trigger in the Octopath engine.
which makes me immediately want to enter semantic nerd mode and retort with and push my glasses up and say,
Its engine is actually Unreal Engine 4.
I do understand the sentiment. We want a fresh coat of paint on RPGs that we consider classics. It's why I made the pact with Enki as a preteen, after all. I'm not just trying to make up a guy or opinion to get mad at either. This is all my opinion, and I'm not trying to change anyone's mind about this. I respect anyone's opinions to the contrary. I just want to put my cards on the table. Further, I should say that my favorite version to actually play of Dragon Quest is the mobile and Switch versions, despite how clunky I find the mobile UX and how put off I am by the Switch version's globs of Vaseline smeared across every asset. Yeah, it's missing a little bit of content, but I think the overall experience is smoother. So, aesthetics can definitely take the backseat to gameplay for me. Regardless of my feelings on HD-2D, it is a sellable style. And let's not forget the bottom line of this remake. It's marketed toward modern audiences and modern sensibilities. Its historic and cultural significance aside, this is a product. Game companies don't remake old games just to please legacy fans. Game companies try to maximize sales by appealing to the biggest markets, and that is often broached by trying to get people to play old games without actually having to play old games. We're spending $60 to get a gussied up experience of Dragon Quest III, and Square Enix wants to make sure this one lasts. It's another reason why we're getting remakes of 1 and 2 as well. On that subject, we've been told to expect some extra plot elements to more cleanly connect the other 2 games in the Erdrick trilogy, which include Dragon Quest 1, 2, and 3, but I have noticed some interesting visual callbacks to Dragon Quest 8 and Dragon Quest 11. So it should be really interesting and fun to see how this remake tries to connect to other games in the series, if it does at all. Like the Super Famicom version, the version of the game that many fans believe is the heretofore best way to play Dragon Quest III. I hate that statement. But anyway, this remake has a shot to rebalance and redefine Dragon Quest III mechanics for a new generation of RPGs, to provide features that make it hard to go back to an older version of Dragon Quest III. The HD-2D remake is posited as the premier way to play Dragon Quest III. The other versions aren't being delisted, and this is branded as Dragon Quest III HD-2D remake underline for a reason, whether we like it or not. Gameplay-wise, this feels like an extended revisit rather than a remake. And I don't mean that pejoratively. Dragon Quest is a very comfortable series, and this will be a familiar but spruced up version of the game. I don't think it'll be so far removed from its source material that we have to entertain countless video essays about how this is the Ship of Theseus version of Dragon Quest III. Very rarely do casual gamers, the target audience of almost any video game, go back and play the same game twice. So chances are that most people playing Dragon Quest III for the first time will only play this version. We've already seen a massive rework of the game's build since its original debut trailer over 3 years ago. That might be troubling to some, but if you really look at the new trailers, you can see how much attention to detail the developers are putting in. Will this become legacy fans' favorite iteration of Dragon Quest III? Will it replace or eclipse the memories they have of this game? Nostalgia may have fixed that fight already, but that doesn't mean that this remake won't come out swinging. I don't think it needs to replace the original, and nor should it ever. No matter what the remake turns out to be, it will be Dragon Quest. Not just literally, but in all its core conceits. Regardless of how loosened or tightened up the mechanics end up being, the story, the world, and the music are all there, and unabashedly Dragon Quest. And that's exactly where I feel this series shines the most brightly, when it's unwaveringly, uncompromisingly Dragon Quest.